We are Karana, a group of technologists who have been working on evaluating technology systems in India, especially in the intersections of both policy, society, and how technical architecture of these systems are being built. And today we have with us three individuals, amazing individuals, Jasmine, George, Dr. Anand, and Dr. Gowri, who are going to explain us the issues related to telemedicine policies and standards in India. And I'll let Jasmine take over and let the discussion begin.
Thank you, Srinivas. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. Super excited to be hosting the session on telemedicine specifically. So today we'll be talking about telemedicine policies and standards in India. And to have a conversation around this, we have people and experts from the field who have been working on this issue and have been trying to figure out if this could be a way that most of us could go ahead with. So before we start the session, I would just like to introduce the panel once to all of us. We have Dr. Anand with us, who is a general practitioner and has a special interest in medical ethics and technology. He consults on EHRs, clinical decision support, and data ethics. We also have Dr. Gowri with us, who is a clinician and a pragmatic telemedicine proponent and a practitioner. She heads the medical operations at DocSat, an online healthcare provider. And I'm Jasmine George. I'm a lawyer and I'm a founder at Hidden Pockets, a platform for sexual and reproductive health services. So all the panelists here have been dealing with telemedicine at different aspects. And it's in the last 60 days, especially during the lockdown, a lot of conversations around telemedicine has really become very prominent. So we thought it would make a lot of sense to just create some kind of context for our audience. What is the history of telemedicine? It seems like it's a very new fancy thing, but has it been around? How old is telemedicine, especially in aspects of health, digital health in India? So I would just ask Dr. Gowri if you could just throw some light around this specific issue.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. Thanks for a wonderful introduction. I think it's a fantastic topic to discuss because considering that with the COVID scenario and with the lockdown, I think this has come up so much that it's a pertinent thing that we talk about. In terms of history as such, we need to understand that this is not something which is new, even for when we look at history of telemedicine within India as well. Right? If we had to go by what WHO talks about telemedicine, it is basically provision of healthcare where distance is a critical factor, right? Where the healthcare provider gets information through digital technology or digital medium, which is required for the healthcare professional to, say, diagnose, treat, provide preventive care if required. Telemedicine being used for, say, continued medical education, for patient education. So telemedicine has been used for many aspects within healthcare, right? And within, if we had to talk about telemedicine within India, I think it's been about 2 decades, right? The first time that it happened was way back in 2001 when, ISRO worked with Apollo to get telemedicine up and about for the rural population. So when we talk of telemedicine in India, it has been going around in pockets, including government having brought up a lot of projects, be it for, say, cancer network or for chronic disease prevalence. For that matter, a lot of things the government has also done, including, formation of a task force for telemedicine. Even in private sectors, in silos that we have seen, right from, say, Narayana Hridayalaya to say, NIMHANS in Bangalore to Gangaram in Delhi, the regional cancer center in Trivandrum. So there have been a lot of engagements in terms of telemedicine by different providers, specifically oriented towards, say, giving healthcare to people who need it most. So be it, say, rural population. So in India, the problem lies, one is that our population is huge, right? The other thing is that there is a disparity between where the need is and where the doctor is, right? And that becomes a problem. So how do we connect that bridge, right? And that's where telemedicine comes in. So in terms of what I look forward in telemedicine is that, this is a fantastic thing that now people have been speaking about it. Also because now that modern telemedicine is coming into place, there are more cost-effective avenues, right? There are more cheaper devices available, right? Even for monitoring patients and so on and so forth. And that has brought telemedicine into light right now. And I think the moment is ripe for us to kind of work towards getting it in the right form, I feel. So I'm hoping that this discussion brings out a lot of answers for many of us.
Thank you, Dr. Gowri. And I think so on that note, we'll actually start with how suddenly it became such a buzzword, telemedicine. Like you pointed out that it has been around for 20 years. And suddenly this whole conversation, especially during lockdown, became like telemedicine is like a new thing, and how do we engage with it? So I also wanted to share our own experience, especially at the platform that we work with. In the nonprofit sector, I mean, when the lockdown happened, for a lot of us, suddenly we realized that everything has to happen online. And at Hidden Pockets, we run a care line service, and we were used to using WhatsApp. So what we did was using the existing infrastructure. And we realized that people started really flooding on these care line numbers. People started messaging us, started asking us questions, and especially because we speak sexual and reproductive health. We are people who only do service around these issues. And we realized that people find it extremely easy. So from a patient's perspective, that is something very innovative for us to realize that people are comfortable talking about the issues. And like Dr. Gowri mentioned, these were people not from the main cities, not from the metropolitans, but from the tier 1, tier 2 cities. So suddenly, even if non-profit sector had not seen the opportunity, the young people or the clients already saw the opportunity. So we sometimes joke about it that we might not have thought about the word telemedicine. We were just thinking that we were doing messaging, but people started telling us that maybe you are doing telecounseling, telehealth, or telemedicine. So it's very interesting that how young people or the people from the different parts of the population started using WhatsApp as an aspect to access health services. So I think that was a very potential way that the clients, the young people, they told us, especially in the nonprofit sector, that maybe this is a better way of delivering than how we have been doing it. So I personally think it's very interesting how telemedicine is being defined, telemedicine is being accessed, or how the very definition of the word, and this is something we'll again later come up to, has been coming out between people. Also, these questions about, so often when we even hear the word telemedicine, there's this technology involved, there's internet involved, there's so much of these strangers involved. And often we have been asked at Hidden Pockets that how do you trust, or how does a client trust you? And we often say this when somebody's coming to us on an issue like sexual and reproductive health. Often what they want is anonymity. What they want is some kind of a care, some kind of a question answers that would not judge them, that would not pull them down, and actually provide them this service. And fascinatingly, it's the platform which is doing that work. So we have counselors on the other side who are providing the care using the existing infrastructure. So the question around can people trust, it's the other way around, that maybe we have been too scared of the internet, too scared of the technology. And if people have been adopting it, maybe we figure out how we can evolve this technology. Some of the things that we also mentioned that, and we thought about, like, why is that young people are so comfortable about WhatsApp? And this is something we realized that because WhatsApp is already an existing infrastructure on their phone, it might just be an app. It's already there. So people feel like we don't have to download something extra. It is already there, that they feel that nobody's going to check their phone. Because we on our care line service, most of our cases are around abortion. And we realize that when nobody wants to talk about abortion and nobody wants to be ever associated with abortion. But since you're talking to someone on WhatsApp, nobody ever thinks that you'll be talking about abortion to somebody on WhatsApp. So the anonymity, or the fact that an app like WhatsApp could be used for fun, was used in advantage by the young people. So again, how patients or the young people or the clients, how they use the technology, that is something very fascinating. And that's again something that we have been learning from our clients. Personally, our interest, especially at our work, grew more after the lockdown, because post March 25th, we saw a huge surge on our care line number. And we also saw how people have been using it. So we suddenly realized that people find it comfort, people can't go out, they're really using a platform, and they're really trusting people or service providers or counselors with their information. So people have been using it during lockdown time. And so if the question is, and this is where I'm going to lead on to the next part of it, is this a new normal? I'm not sure about. But definitely, if this is the normal that can help people deal with the lockdown times, or deal with the pandemic, or deal with the fact that we need to maintain social distancing, maybe it's a good time. So even in the conversation around telemedicine, I mean, even when we have been talking, a lot of people have a lot of difficulty with the word telemedicine. Like, so are you really delivering medicine? I mean, how can you trust young people? How can you trust these people who are just randomly telling you symptoms? I mean, how can you trust? So there's trust at so many levels. There's a mistrust of the technology. There's a mistrust of the internet. There's a mistrust of the service provider. And there's a mistrust of the client. How can you prove if the client is not lying? How can you prove the client is, really telling you the truth? I mean, how can you really go ahead with this kind of a system? But in this scenario and in this new normal that we have been forced to live in, it seems like young people or clients have picked it up. It's time for service providers to come on board. It's time for especially doctors, because again, we have to understand in this field where medicine is an extremely high sorted also kind of a profession which comes with a lot of responsibility. And I'm going to actually move on to the next section where I'm going to ask Dr. Gowri to join us and tell us from the perspective of medical practitioners. I mean, in general, even though you mentioned that this technology or this kind of a conversation has been around for 20 years, how has been generally the reactions of doctors? And I mean, over time, do you think things have changed, how doctors have been engaging, or how has technology become better that doctors feel a lot more comfortable trusting and using this?
Yes. Yes, Jasmine, I agree with you. I think patient adoption and doctor, I mean, there are two sides to it, right? And rather three sides to it. There is somebody who needs care, there is somebody who's providing care, and then there is this technology which is bringing these two together, right? So I will definitely talk about what a doctor feels. Now, we need to understand that though telemedicine has been around, as a doctor, we are not taught what to do in telemedicine, right? In the traditional system of schooling, where doctors are trained, right? It's about how to diagnose. So I would be taking your history, I would be understanding all your symptomatology, I'll be doing a thorough examination, then I'll be able to understand and hopefully get to a probable diagnosis, and then maybe give you a proper management plan, right? Now, what has happened with telemedicine is that this big chunk of not being able to touch and feel and communicate in terms of examination, right, has kind of been a big no-no, because doctors are not used to not doing it, right? We are not sure, and we do not have specific guidelines which tell us that what we can do in a telemedicine. If I am not able to do examination, to what length can I go in terms of treating online, and what are the right ways in terms of when do I refer, what do I do, so these things have not yet been put down in paper. We have enough number of guidelines which tell us how to, say, diagnose and treat a particular illness from a regular perspective, but not from a perspective of a telemedicine. So naturally, there are a lot of doubts and concerns, because doctors do not want to be in the wrong, right? Nobody wants to do wrong to the patient. And hence this sense of insecurity about really adopting telemedicine in that sense, right? But I think with technology development, I'm sure that, now, so it started off with a chat, right? So in general, telemedicine also initially was very asynchronous. When I say asynchronous, it means that maybe I wrote an email, then you wrote me an email, or I messaged you and then you did. It's very asynchronous. From being asynchronous to a place where it was synchronous on, say, a desktop or a laptop where people are talking, to a place where you are on a phone and doing a video consult, which is inexpensive, at the same time synchronous, right? I think these are the things and these are the improvements which will make a doctor want to do better. Like, having more medical devices. if I have better biosensors, if I have better apps or better things that come in, which tells me vital information about the patient on the go as I am talking to my patient, hopefully that will give me enough and more data to come to a probable diagnosis and then treat it better, I feel. So the reason why doctors are still not very comfortable with it is because of the fact that we do not still have enough and more put together in a technology, right, to aid the doctor to do what is right for the patient. And of course, when you are uncertain and there is a sense of unknown, then you tend to kind of step back in that approach. But what I have seen is, at least in the last 5-6 years of me looking through telemedicine as such, you know, I've seen that the adoption within doctors have increased because they do see this. One is practice, right? You need to grow your practice. Now, when I sit in my clinic, my geographical boundaries are set, right? So the number of people that I can cater to is set. I cannot go beyond that. Now, telemedicine or technology helps me bridge that. I can jump out of that, right? I can, my boundaries are limitless. And that is what I think technology can aid doctors. And I think, so it's a combination of having better technology and better infrastructure, which will help the doctor to get better information about the patient and the problem that he or she has. And secondly, having set telemedicine guidelines of how and what to treat much more in depth, rather than just, you know, having it just as such, but in depth with each diagnosis. I think we can create that and we have that validated. I think that would make doctors more willing and more wanting to adopt telemedicine. But I'm seeing an increase also in the years. And I think post-COVID, I think a lot of doctors have also, like you mentioned, patients have come online. Doctors have also come online because I think that's the natural progression, as I say, of what has happened. So we have seen a lot of doctors coming in and taking up telemedicine and serving people online. So I think that it is going to change. I think it will change with time. Yeah.
So, Dr. Gowri, I also wanted to connect it to, so one of the things that we noticed on our platforms when we were trying to connect to doctors specifically for abortion or MTP, so a lot of doctors were very scared. They were like, we can't do consultation. And even with the telemedicine guidelines that came out, there was no clarity. So there was this vagueness around it. So even the gynecologists specifically were very scared and they wanted to stay away from this whole telemedicine business. They were like, we don't want to be engaged in this. So some of the fears that you have also mentioned, like what are, like, so even we were trying to understand that what are these fears that doctors really have and what are some of the things that make it even more tougher. So first of all, they don't know, they have not been introduced to this kind of system. And on top of it, there is this vagueness and there's no clarity about what can they do. So can you also tell us what are these real fears? Because just to make it more tangible, like for the audience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the other fears definitely are what would happen if I prescribe a particular drug and something happens to the patient because the patient is not in front of me. See, when I'm sitting in my clinic, if let's take the same example as you put up, right? Patients are coming for, say, medical termination of pregnancy, and that's a huge, I think it's a huge problem where patients are not very sure if they can go or want to go face to face with a doctor, but they're more comfortable with the anonymity that they get online. But at the same time, patient is ready to come. The problem is here, there are no set guidelines on how and when the doctor can prescribe, right? The MTP Act has nothing written about telemedicine. The MTP Act very clearly says that you have to diagnose, you have to examine. So if I'm not examining, I can't write that drug. So it's not, I mean, so there is this policy problem. There is an asynchrony between what is written and it not containing things which are related to telemedicine. That's the problem. And that's a fear naturally, because one, the patient is not in front of me. Two, if the patient is somewhere else and patient has say a serious side effect or a complication, of course the doctor is going to be held liable. Even in the telemedicine new guidelines which has set up, it is the doctor who is liable for anything going wrong. And then the doctor says, why would I want to take it upon my head? So that is and I think it's a valid fear, I would say, unless we do something about it. I think doctors would always want to not get into that sphere of prescribing where it is not in line with the law that is currently in place. So
Dr. Gowri, since you have also been managing and you've seen a lot of teleconsultations that have happened, are there any stories that you think, I mean, it shows such a humane side of telemedicine that this is what telemedicine could do? And so some positive stories for doctors or for patients, how telemedicine actually, accelerated some of the solutions that digital health could do.
So, we need to understand why patient comes online, right? So patient comes online either for, say, ease of consultation, right? So I easily got a doctor, without traveling too much or spending too much time or money. The other reason that a patient comes is anonymity and privacy, right? And the third reason is second opinions, right? So these are the three buckets that we can put and say why a patient would want to come online, right? And we see a huge traction in terms of online consultations, as you mentioned, for mental health issues, for sexual health problems, women with gynecological problems, menstrual issues which they are not very comfortable talking about, or things which are of second opinion, that people may have had already undergone, say, treatment for cancer, and they would want to get a second opinion saying, this is very expensive, is there something else, or do I need to really go for a surgery? Things like that, right? So these are the reasons why patients come online. So I feel that in terms of getting patients to understand, we need to understand what patient wants and then provide it that way. I feel if we can do that, and understand that there is a limitation to it, if we can do that, then that is great. So what I have seen as stories is we have been able to pick up, we have been able to diagnose early on. A patient did not go to the doctor, like chronic coughs, and turned out to be something more sinister. So like we were able to pick up issues because the patient himself did not feel that it was serious enough. But then, but patient said, okay, I'll just come online and talk to someone because somebody said. Or we were able to pick up serious problems online. We have been able to help prevent suicides. And I know it is difficult because it's very difficult for somebody to get up and go and seek help, but they have had the courage to message or come online and just seek for that last thread of help, and we have been able to help that. I think patients with a lot of sexual health education, I think, which is very lacking, still lacking in India, and people have all kinds of questions, and they don't even know whom to ask. They don't even talk to their parents, for that matter. They would, but they would come online and talk about it. I think these issues, we need to understand that they are best handled online, and that's fantastic that we have been able to do it, right? And provide that touch that was required, because these are the people who may never go offline. So these are the people who may never go offline, and they had this avenue and they used it, and we were able to help them at that point in time. So I think those are the few of the things that we have done wonderfully when it comes to telemedicine.
I mean, these stories definitely give us a lot of hope, and I mean, it also makes us feel that the urgency of actually moving online and pushing, and maybe even asking for, a demand which is very patient driven, which has rights of doctors, practices, and a better technology. So moving on to Dr. Anand, the patients are asking for it, the doctors are asking for it, but the law is still behind. So, what is the current state of regulation on telemedicine? Because most of us are still trying to figure out what is the law around it. Also, I'm just going to add on to that. I mean, do you think, is there any guidelines, any court orders that some of us can go to just to understand what is the legal status quo? Dr. Anand, I think so. I can't hear you. You need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Jasmine. Till very recently, people who were practicing telemedicine were kind of on their own, in a sense that obviously the work that was happening in the government setup had the backing of the organizations that they were working with. But the folks that were practicing in the private sector rested their case on three sort of components. The first being that the MCI Act of 1953 sort of describes who can practice medicine in India, which is basically anybody who's been registered with a medical council in the country can practice medicine. And it also talks about what a valid prescription is. So that's the two components of doing the medicine part. The second was that in 2015, the Pharmacy Council, which regulates training and registration of pharmacists in India, produced a practice guideline which sort of mentions that prescriptions can be digital. That's all it does, but we'll take it. And the IT Act of 2000 mentions how you can digitally sign an electronic health record. So if you put these three things together, you can kind of say that, as long as it's a registered medical practitioner giving a prescription that is, in a valid format and it has been securely signed, you're safe. Uh, Fortunately, we don't have as much of a litigation culture in medicine as in some countries. So we've not really had any major issues with telemedicine from the patient side in that malpractice suits and stuff like that. Now, the last month, the Medical Council of India came up with a set of guidelines for telemedicine in India, which it's sort of a broad practice framework, how to go about doing it. It so it sort of uh, it's for people who it sort of assumes that this is new. So it's not as applicable to people who have been doing this for a long time as it is to people who are just starting off. So it kind of fails to take into account, stuff that's already been going on. So, for example, it has prescribed a list of drugs that you're supposed to prescribe and a list of drugs that you're not supposed to prescribe, which kind of ignores the needs of the people who seek help online. So this disconnect between what do patients seek versus what is the academia and the policymakers in the country comfortable with doing is still there. Although I think the guideline that has been produced is a step, it's a leap forward in the right direction, and hopefully with all the comments they've received, they'll improve it to more align it with what's actually happening. And yeah, so that's the status of the legal. That's the legal status and the guideline status of telemedicine.
Thank you. Since you mentioned about the disconnect between the different stakeholders in this conversation, are you aware, or do you think there are some initiative communities or consortiums who have been trying to bring these different stakeholders together and come about with a more holistic approach towards telemedicine in India?
Um, I think what's happened is that right now I don't think we've got a big tent kind of an approach in which you've got we have organizations that work largely in sexual and reproductive health or in women's empowerment or in poverty. We have organizations that we have something called the Digital Health Providers Association, which is private, all the companies that are providing healthcare like DocsApp, MFine, Liberate, and things like that. They've come together to form an industry coalition. There is Digital Health India, which is a coalition of it's sort of a loose association of people who are it's for doctors or health professionals who do digital health. um, but neither of these sort of organizations have a lot of policy related work so far. There is the Telemedicine Society of India, which has been around for 20 years, which does which does a lot of conferences, and it's produced some really good papers about the state of telemedicine in India, but like not really solid policy work. You have So this is sort of the medical and the health related, and the Jan Swasthya Sahayog, who produces brilliant papers and brilliant policy work when it comes to gender and sexuality and reproductive health. Uh, on another sort of a sort of a group is the tech policy law, folks. So you have the Software Freedom Law Center, you have Karana, and you have the Center for Internet and Society, and folks like that who've kind of also produced a lot of interesting work. But I think we haven't reached a point where everybody is sort of doing a unified consultation. What's interesting though is that one of the most important policy makers for healthcare in India is an organization known as iSpirit Foundation, and which has been entrusted with sort of building the national health stack. But we don't really know a lot about the organization and its consultative process. So while at least there is some amount of awareness, between the people that I've mentioned of each other, I don't really know much about. I mean, I mean, the story is different with iSpirit.
So it seems like there are a lot of stakeholders who have been doing parallel work, and there's definitely data or stack being created somewhere. So I also wanted to ask about the data aspects of it. So all this telemedicine and all these conversations that are happening on all these different platforms, so how exactly are these recorded? And if you could also talk about the electronic health records and generally the standards that we have in India in terms of saving data or archiving data, especially with regard to medical health.
Okay, so formally, I guess, so we've not had any specific legislation that deals with health data. The IT Act mentions it, of 2000 and later mentions it as being protected information. But we have a bill that's been tabled recently called the Personal Data Protection Bill, which defines, what is personal health data, how much privacy do you get, and it's quite, it talks about consent, it talks about, retraction of consent, and lays down the penalties that are there for people who breach these things. But one of the interesting things is that there is sort of a broad caveat that it's obvious that the bill promotes the idea that the government ultimately has a say in whether you get privacy or not, and it kind of exempts a lot of government agencies from having to follow these laws, and the right to sort of strike off the need for these things as at their discretion, which is quite significantly opposed to what pretty much every learned committee and organization that has really researched this issue has spoken up. And it's also again the spirit of what the Supreme Court has been has ruled in 2017. So it's there are problematic aspects to that. Now, when it comes to the personal aspects of that, I mean, as you mentioned, a lot of people use WhatsApp for doing telemedicine. So I mean, we kind of joke to each other that that WhatsApp is probably the country's largest EHR provider, because it's not just you and me, it's like everyone I know uses WhatsApp for medical consultations. And the upside is it's really easy to use, right? And but the downside is you have no control over your data. The data is owned by Facebook, and is used by Facebook, I think. Yeah. And so we actually do have EHR standards in the country. The last one was put out in 2016. It's a bit dated now, but it kind of demonstrates the complexity of creating an EHR in India, creating an EHR in general. So it sort of lays down the standards for the technical specs for what are the different components of an EHR, how do you code for them, what kind of international standards should you use to sort of create each of those components, and things like that. So, but it's sort of so it's so detailed that it kind of is extremely challenging for somebody who's starting an app or somebody who's starting a company to look at. And if you look at that and you think that if I have to implement all this, I'll never get the app out. So to quantify that, it refers to 32 different ISO standards for encoding different aspects of the data that you're using. That's impractical. Like nobody is gonna do that, and we don't need to do that. There are far simpler ways of solving that problem. It also refers to the SNOMED CT, which is an American clinical terminology database, which has no Indianizations in it, which is not available in Indian languages, which is not available for private practitioners unless except at a great cost. So it sort of does a very good job of saying these are the best possible standards. So that exists, but the impracticality of that kind of is demonstrated by the fact that everybody just uses WhatsApp. Yeah.
I mean, having all these guidelines in place, so many standards, it definitely sounds like a warning, or even sounds a little scary for a lot of us to actually think about coming up with new applications, or even coming up with providing solutions. So how has been in general the startup culture, all the health culture in India responded to these standards, the EHR standards?
I think so. Since there isn't too much clarity about how enforceable these standards are, and because the tech space in the last 3 years or in the last 4 years, which is much after the standards came out, has probably produced more products than in probably the 10 years before that. So we are talking about a different like game altogether. So it sort of responded in the way we generally very pragmatically Indians do things, which is that we'll do our best, right? And I've worked with a lot of different startups in this area, and one of the things that like we are now starting to understand, or like, I think they are starting to understand, is that there is so that when you are providing healthcare in a digital format, you're kind of becoming a healthcare provider. So the standards that apply to you are not just about law or about regulations or about international standards. They're also about ethics, and they're also about the fact that you have people's lives in your hands, which is something that when I talk to coders, or when I work with a project manager and stuff like that, it's something that is a little difficult to explain, that you are a healthcare provider. You're not just doing JavaScript. Like you're involved in the process of providing healthcare, and so there needs to be talk about ethics, data ethics, ethics in machine learning, because everybody's doing it. And so that's an area of like great personal interest, and it's an area that is sort of just sort of blooming, I think, in India, because now there is a greater awareness that it's important, and not just sort of for the sake of doing a like a checkbox thing, but because people are recognizing that you can actually do harm. And this is something that you learn very early in medicine, is that one of the reasons why you is that like at some point in your practice you are going to harm a patient, and that's something that's going to stay with you. Like it's something that's going to change you and mold you as as an individual, as a physician. And this is something that I guess tech is also starting to see now, is that they are doing harm to patients by not following standards, by not having privacy protocols in place and things like that. And that sort of creates, it's a terrible way to learn, but it's sort of creating a feedback that that sets in that, okay, uh, I do JavaScript, but I'm kind of a healthcare provider. So yeah.
Since you brought in the data ethics, and you also mentioned about breach of consent, so I also want to open up this question for Dr. Gowri also, and just to say that how do we, and since it's also a good Java or a script problem for the coders also, that how do you translate consent in a telemedicine? Because even in our SRHR, sexual and reproductive health service sector, we also find it difficult. How do you translate consent? Like how can you actually bring about consent from a patient perspective, from a doctor's perspective, and also how can a platform provide space for such a nuanced thing? Because it affects all of us.
So I think Dr. Anand can add on to this. But what I understand is that if a patient has come to a doctor for a health issue, right, and the patient is seeking help, there is an implied consent there any which way. Okay, there is an implied consent when I as a patient come to you with a healthcare problem. There is an implied consent there, and I think this is written even in the newest telemedicine guidelines that Dr. Anand was mentioning, which came out a couple of 2 months back from a doctor, for the doctors it had come out, that there is an implied consent. But if there is but then we need to understand that there needs to be consent taken at each step when it comes to, say, use of data, or what are we doing with that data, or where it is going to be used. So by itself, from a perspective of serving or not serving, helping the patient with the healthcare problem, the health issue or the problem, there is an implied consent there if the patient himself or herself comes and seeks it. It also mentions that if you're taking a consent for or taking a consultation for somebody else, which can be, say, for my child, say if it's a pediatric case and I'm consulting online for my child, or for somebody who's unable to give consent or is not available, then there needs to be a written consent or a consent in a audio or a video format, where the patient himself or herself is giving that I am giving this consent for this particular consultation to go through this particular person, which is a proxy consultation. So by and large, there is a consent which is already there. The reason is because there is somebody who is seeking help and there is somebody who is providing that help. So that is there. But I think Anand can, maybe Dr. Anand can put in more into the consent when it comes to use of data. And I think that is extremely important, right? So because once that comes to the doctor and the doctor writes a prescription in a digital format or feeds in that data into an EHR system, then who has their eye to it, right? Because in my opinion, the patient owns that data because it's patient's, right? So we need to ask him or her at every step for what reason and when it is being used, because, well, we need to also understand that and hence it is so airtight and locked, right? Because we need to understand that this data is also useful for research. This data is useful for understanding a lot of things, which will help us in making our systems better. But maybe I would ask Dr. Anand more about it in terms of consent itself.
Okay, thanks, Gowri. So broadly, what Dr. Gowri just pointed out is the approach that pretty much everybody is taking. If you've had an online consult, you've implied consent to have the consultation. But legally, consent is an extremely a complex issue, and it's not been well defined in any of the laws that we have so far, or in the policies like the National Health Stack, the National Digital Blueprint, or like pretty much anything else that's come out so far. It's in fact been dealt with sort of very cursorily. And yeah, I guess as a greater culture, we have a problem with understanding consent, which has led to the greater and more particular issues that we face. So one of the things that one of the new laws is proposing is that we document consent in a standardized format. So they've prescribed an XML format for doing that. Now, what's actually happening on ground is that if you installed an app, any telemedicine app, you at the beginning, had this whole end user license agreement, which nobody reads, and you said, okay, and enter. At that point, you basically have given the right for using anonymized and depersonalized information to the provider, right? So these are two terms. So this basically means anonymization and depersonalization are reversible and irreversible ways of identifying who the data comes from, right? So if you've done that little click button thing, you've given the health provider the right to use your data as long as that data cannot be traced back to you. So that is to say, if they've removed your name, your PIN code, your identifiable details, they can do pretty much anything they want with it, which is really sort of not really in tune with the spirit of how consent works. And for example, that's really not how research ethics and consent in research and informed consent, in general in the practice of medicine is supposed to work. But that is the state right now. What can you do with data that can be reversibly identified, and that you can temporarily remove who this person is, and then later identify who this person is? That kind of data, what can be done with it? If so, ethically speaking, I think organizations, tech companies have the duty to inform patients every single time this sort of identification is happening. When data is being, revealed to somebody, or some data scientist in the company is running some model based, on this, or somebody's building a language model based on the chats, or whatever it is. Like, you actually have an ethical responsibility to disclose this to your patients. But I think that culture is something that still needs to come in. And more than culture, I think it's only when the law takes it up that it'll really get properly enforced.
I think so. With specific regard to informed consent, it's very difficult also because the patients need to be explained also that their consent is being taken for these aspects, and for all these issues it can be later used again. But again, this is also a context and also a cultural factor that most of the times when patients or clients are reaching the app or are downloading an app or are finally meeting a doctor, it's in terms of crisis. And during that time, if you have to just give consent, how informed is this consent? It's a debatable question. But again, since we are discussing the ethical issue around here, if we are going to standardize a practice here, and if consent word is going to be thrown around, how are we going to replicate it? Because like Dr. Anand did mention that it's very difficult, or as a practice when you're working with a coder, the practice of informed consent, the practice of ethics rarely gets translated into the codes itself. So I'm trying to figure out like where exactly does the breach happen? Because most of the time the patient might not even realize that there was a breach of consent that happened. Only, or it's already been happened, and since they might never get to know because they don't know where all the data went on. But the very fact that if we can tell our clients, and especially with regard to sensitive data, because like so in our work, something we've realized that a lot of our clients used to keep saying that generally when we get an abortion, people tend to call them back after 15 days. Are you fine? And is this a breach of consent? Is this breach of privacy? Is this, what exactly is this? We don't know. Legally speaking, we are still trying to figure out a word for it. But definitely, this is something they're terrified of. So one of the things they keep telling us is that whatever happens, do not contact me back. I don't want any trace of this conversation or this kind of a history and ever. And I think that this is something to do with the sensitive data part, be it with the marginalized community, anybody who thinks their data is sensitive. And technically in a medical field, this is a presumption that I'm making, that every data should be very considered and dealt as a sensitive data. So heading from this issue to privacy, and I've always felt like on the issue of privacy, something as abstract as privacy, and trying to figure this out in a cultural context like India, where people are still trying to figure out how to talk about menstrual taboos. How do we ensure privacy, and how much can right to privacy can a client also seek for? So I'll start with the legal aspect first, and Dr. Anand, I'm going to ask about what are some of the regulations around health data privacy and access to privacy rights itself for a client.
Uh, okay. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, the laws that govern this area broadly give us a lot of rights, but they also hold the right to withdraw those rights. So where does that leave us is something that I guess legal scholars will need to really debate. The second aspect of this is that the country is right now designing what's called the National Health Stack, which sort of is a digital infrastructure for connecting every digital health platform in this country. Think of it like a gigantic market where everybody has sort of ways of exchanging information with each other in a way to remove silos. Now, One of the worrying things about it is that it is entirely built on top of the assumption that every patient will be 100% identifiable. In fact, there are talks of giving so there are circulars about giving each patient in India a non-duplicate national digital health identity or a national health number, and sort of build that on top of Aadhaar, and which is now I understand that from a technology point of view, and this is the problem of sort of technologists not having conversations with physicians and nurses and activists, which is that from a tech point of view it totally makes sense ki, obviously we need to identify who's doing what. But if you ask like any health provider in this country, and all the discussion we've just had, it's very clear that the right to privacy, the right to anonymity, the need for having a sort of a sacred relationship with the health provider, which you can then forget about. These are all like very essential to the practice of medicine. And if you take that away from people, it's going to extremely adversely affect the people who are already marginalized so much. Already with the the Aadhaar identification issue, we saw folks. Patients living with HIV go off ART treatment. Like it's a crime against humanity for having and all those people to have put them through that, and it's a like it's a terrible thing that we did. And if we are so our policies sort of seem to be completely ignoring the fact that privacy is sort of like you can't really do really good healthcare unless you've got your basics like this right. It sort of is ignoring that, which is extremely worrying. So this is something that I think we all need to talk to our representatives about, our political representatives about.
I mean, especially in context of privacy, whenever there's this conversation of, I don't want this to be on record, or I don't want this medical history to be saved anywhere, there's always this questions that what is there to hide? And I think that this is in general, privacy activists have been debating or having engaged with. But if everything is going online, is there an option of not archiving? Is there an option of not putting this in your medical history? So going to Dr. Gowri around this, I mean, there is definitely a certain part of medical history which is useful. It's helpful to engage with the patient if we have the data with us, and it can be really helpful. So what I'm trying to ask is there a way of engaging with the data which can help in diagnosing, but at the same time can also keep the aspects of privacy intact? Is there a way out that maybe as health practitioners we can think of?
Absolutely, and I think there should be. I mean, like just to when I sit in my clinic and I practice, right, and I converse with you as a patient, what you've told me is just there in that room, right? And that's what has kind of been taken away when you have an EHR system and you're typing it away and everything is there kind of stored, right? Now it has its own advantages and disadvantages, right? Because it is stored. Next time that you come to me, I know exactly what to talk to you about, or I know everything about you. Having said that, I think it is very important that there are certain things which have to be between a doctor and a patient, right? And that's why the privileged doctor-patient communication, as we say, because it is a privileged communication. You came to me with trust. You came to me with, the belief and faith that I would keep it between them. And that's how it is. I think the healthcare profession is like that, wherein the person who comes seeking for help has a lot of things that he may want to only tell the provider, right? And here, hence, it is important that what is conversed between these two and something, because data is, I think, the property of the person who gives it, which means the patient. He has a choice to say that this is something that I do not want to be documented. And I think that choice should be left to that person, right? And we can have avenues in EHR systems where these can still be fed into the system, but it is only for the doctor's eye, or for the patient's eye, or for the patient to give consent to for it to be seen, Otherwise it won't be seen. I think there should be a way, and I'm sure that there is technology, from technology perspective, it's possible to have that. But I think it's extremely important, because that is the only way. A lot of times with privacy, why doctors do not engage also on telemedicine is because a lot of patients come and give false information, not because they don't want to give it. Like again, going back, might be people who are underage, or people who might not actually give you the right age, right? And that itself brings in a lot of other things, right? Now a doctor is scared because doctor doesn't want to get into the hassle. And the patient doesn't give it because patient is afraid of that what would happen, what are the consequences. Now there are two ways, both of them are scared. If we have an avenue where both of them can talk freely and have that privacy within the digital system, right, then the right healthcare is going to be provided. Otherwise it is always going to be a miss, right? We will not be doing the right job. Patient won't be doing right for himself or herself. Doctor won't be doing at the same time. So this is required, and I'm sure the technology can provide us with that a safe haven, in that sense, where it is for the patient and for the doctor's eye only, and only when the patient wants it to be seen. I think it should be provided.
One of the things that we noticed on our care line was that people often ask us that, because we work on sexual and reproductive health, that are people comfortable? Are young people comfortable? How can they trust you with so much of information? And so are they not scared of privacy issue? And often we have seen that because we are like the last response, they are coming to us towards a crisis. Privacy is not a thought. It's not a thought, and they're really scared. So there's a fear. They've literally drowned in Google, and then they've reached some of these apps. And because of word of mouth, because of previous good experiences, they are coming and sharing. So often, a lot of time is just spent on building trust. A lot of times, just actually doing the informed consent practice, saying that this is what you have to tell us. This is something that we need to know, like the age. But these are things you have to tell us for us to figure out where to send you or what can be done. But in a way, there is a system around where there are things people are willing to share, there are things that people don't want to share, and there are things that is not needed to share. So I think that these conversations around what is private, what is sensitive for, and I think it's a very personalized experience, because for somebody, their sexual history might not be important, but maybe something related to thyroid might be more important. I think it's a very subjective thing. But again, like, this is something we have been trying to figure out. How does telemedicine makes it into a standardized practice? How do we bring it into the regulations aspects where all of us, or people or stakeholders who have been engaging with this kind of conversation, how do we bring standards that keeps everybody happy, keeps everybody safe? Because we do have to also understand that it's not just enough getting clients and doctors and technologies on platform. We also have to make it work. If the technology is not good enough, doctors fail, the clients are frustrated. If the technology doesn't respect privacy, clients will leave along the way. And doctors are, as you rightly pointed out, doctors are also very scared regarding what are the regulations, what are the laws. So in general, these were some of the conversations that we wanted to engage with, and also put these questions out, asking that if this is the future and if this is the new normal that we are all engaging with, how would we like it to be improved? And this is a good time, since everybody's online, we're also having this conversation online using a video platform. How much of this is something that you are comfortable sharing? So just before we open up this conversation for the audience, I also wanted to ask you, like, do you think this will be the future, or this is a practice that can be called as the future, the telemedicine practice in India?
I think we should not call it a future. It's already there. It's the present. But having said that, we need to understand, again, you see, having been in telemedicine for a long time and having been a practicing physician, sitting in a clinic and doing it face to face, my comment on this thing is, we need to understand what can be dealt with in terms of telemedicine and what can be dealt with when it comes to face-to-face, right? We have to understand that not everything can be telemedicine. Okay, not everything can be telemedicine, but a lot of things which can be dealt with through telemedicine should be done so in the right way. Okay, and I think that's where the problem is, because of the vagueness of it. It is because it's new. People are trying to as I was speaking earlier, you know, there's this all or none. There was a time when nobody would want to take up telemedicine. Now everybody wants to take up telemedicine. I think there has to be a line where we understand that there are certain things which can be done beautifully online, right? Like we talked about, say, mental health, sexual health, so on and so forth. But then there are certain things where examination is a need. If it's a emergency, then it has to be in a hospital, right? So how does technology understand that? How does a patient understand that? And how does a doctor understand that? If we have these three elements rightly, you know, in that place of understanding what can be and cannot be done online and what needs to be done in a hospital setup, and we have that very clearly kind of put down, I think that is the way to go. I mean, telemedicine is, of course, has been there, is there, and will be there. But we need to understand what needs, what ideally comes under the bracket of telemedicine and the right practice in telemedicine. Yeah.
Dr. Anand, would you like to add something?
I think Gauri's sort of, you know, put that together really well. uh, but yeah, I think the kind of things that we'll be able to do online is only going to increase. So you know, she sort of briefly touched about sensors and stuff like that. So you know, potentially a lot of things can be done online, and potentially we can have, you know, machines assisting decision support. uh, we can have, you know, sort of primary care being done by nurses in a safe way. We can, you know, so again, potentially a lot of things can be done. And it really will come down to how safe we make the space for our patients, and how well the market and things like that respond to it. But otherwise, what Gauri said. Yeah.
I think so. It's a great opportunity for to expand the nature of service providers, like you said, even including nurses, and also reducing the workload and for the doctors, so that they can spend more energy on diagnosis and, you know, providing more quality care. Because that's something a lot of our doctors have been. I mean, they have been saying for a long time, and even during, I mean, Corona is a great example. Doctors have been saying they are tired, and somehow we can't, we seem to be just calling them heroes but not doing really anything about it. So I think so this is a great opportunity to help them with a better platform, with better services, and a great opportunity to also increase the stakeholders in these conversations. Like, I think so Dr. Anand did touch about it in the beginning, where we need academicians also, we need
Yeah.
activists, tech activists. I mean, it's important for all these stakeholders to come in, because where are the research papers? Where are the study papers? What is happening in the country? I mean, we have so many universities, so it's good to know, because having these parallel conversations along the way might not really be useful. It might even defeat the movement and defeat the whole. It might be just replication of work. So I think so. It's a great time. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your experiences, and also your hopes. I think so. It's very difficult, especially during such times where nothing seems to be stable anymore. So I think so. Looking and even asking for something concrete is very important. So I just gonna check if there are any audience questions, or if anybody wants to ask anything.
There were a few questions from YouTube and Twitter. So I can just state it for you. There was one question from YouTube which specifically asked, what is the state of consent in other countries? Are there any best practices?
Uh, so I don't have enough data to give you a country-wise breakdown. Um, but some of the best practices are explicit consent that is taken at every stage. So, whenever there is a change of state, so consent was given for A, and now the data is going to be used for something else, or now the care is being shifted from one person to the other, or the data needs to be shared with a third party. At each of those points, the need for explicit consent. So, at change of state, that's one. The second best practice is the right to retraction of consent, which means that today I've said that you can use this data, but tomorrow if I say that no, you can't use my data, the right to have your data deleted and actually expunged, and those are two sort of key things that cover a lot of bases. Uh, when it comes to consent. So there are also some electronic frameworks, so programmatic frameworks for documenting consent, structuring consent, and things like that. I've seen some XML documents that I don't, uh, uh, but how far they have been implemented, and the thing is that consent has a lot of cultural components. So the way consent is dealt with in India is quite different from how it is in the Nordic countries. So you have an extremely individualized system there, where there are pretty like stringent penalties for I don't know if even if a child says he don't tell my parents this, it needs to be taken seriously. Whereas in India, we are still figuring that stuff out, and there is a lot of, it's not just that we don't care about consent, it's also that we have a collaborative culture, and that we are a more family oriented culture. So while these best practices do exist, I think we need to be careful in adopting them while keeping these things. So we definitely need retraction of consent, and state change consent, and really informing what is going to be done with this data. And I think there is a great need for technologists to sort of engage themselves and patients in the question of what are we going to do with your data. And I think companies that will be honest about this in future will definitely be favored by people who by consumers.
I have one question before others ask any. I think I read this recent report by one of the fellow cybersecurity experts who actually analyzed the state of medical data storage in the country, right? So what he looked at was he went around and looked at how are hospitals storing all of their medical records, and right now it's like they're not really aware of any, or they're not really taking any security practices. Like I think he looked at around 300 hospitals, and he found around 200 of them have their servers open on the internet, so anybody
Yeah.
can access patients' health records. So, and most of the times, like because we're discussing consent in particular, you're not even told what part of your information is being stored, right? Like just before the lockdown, I actually went to one of the multi-specialty hospitals, and I've got my prescription. I went to the doctor. I came back, and before I would leave, at every stage, you would have the nurse actually taking the prescription and what the doctor has written, and she would just scan it, right? Like she would just put it in a machine, and it would just get scanned. And at no stage there is a question of okay, we are doing this, are you okay with this? There was no question that I was being asked.
Yeah.
And this was in a hospital where fairly everyone knows what's happening. I let it happen. I looked at things, but when we're talking about all of this information being collected without informing the patient, and it being stored in a not so secure way, uh, I mean, currently there are no liabilities because there is no law, so nobody is ready to enforce things. Where do you see the feature of it especially from the Medical Council of India's perspective, right? Like these practices are at some level unethical, but both the hospitals and doctors are aware of it. How do we even challenge it from both ethical point of view, consent, and even from a governance point of view through MCI?
Gowri?
Yeah, so yeah, as Anand, Dr. Anand was mentioning, right? A lot of it has to do with um, what has been happening all to, the consent and the need for consent and the need for privacy. I think it's something which has come now, right? People never used to talk about it before, and unfortunately what has happened is things have to kind of evolve as the patient is evolving. I think we are coming to an age where these questions are being asked. 10 years back also nobody would bother asking these questions, because it was just implied that when I go to a hospital, these are the things that happen, and we believe that doctors and or nurses or any healthcare professional is whatever they are doing is in the best interest of the patient, right? So that is the thought process that I think pretty much everybody has grown up with, that we look up to them when it comes to a healthcare professional. It's only now that people are coming up with this thing of I own my data, and it's absolutely right in the sense, but I'm saying that now that because this has to change, I think it has never been put down anywhere until very recently, when all the data privacy acts and everything has come up with. So I think it is important that it is there at every step of procedures, wherein what things have to happen at a hospital setting, or what things have to happen when it comes to what can be documented in the EHR. I think a lot of these things are still vague, and we do not have that clarity currently. And because one is, even if they're available, because it is not really enforceable, or it's not really kind of put down into a practice that has to be done, things are kind of going around the way they are. But I'm hoping that it would be adopted well, and people would look at it more seriously, and come up with better stringent measures of implementing it, and then following it up with better audits, or understanding what's happening.
Srinivas, from the perspective of the patient, I think so. We also need to relook at the relationship we have with our service providers. I mean, we tend to culturally see doctors, lawyers, certain professions as not just service providers, but something more than that. The truth, the gods, and it can go across the country. And I think so. What has changed over the time is that the nature, the social contract between these two parties have changed. So even if we have to enforce something like my information, my data, my privacy is being violated, I would actually take, because since we don't have anything currently legal in hands to enforce it, I would take the path of contracts. I would say it's a breach of contract. I would say it's a breach of consent. And I mean, that's just simply speaking. But I think so what we need is better practices. So like Dr. Gowri also said, that if somebody is storing my phone number, and if I'm getting non-stop messages from that specific service provider selling their apps, selling their products, I think so in my head that's breach of contract, because I should have been informed why is my number being taken, and I should have a right to get out of it. So I think so it's as simple as that. If even in the medical profession, if a client is giving, there's a certain kind of trust. And if I feel like I keep getting calls, or at a certain level my trust was breached, I go ahead with a contractual obligation against the service provider. But again, instead of taking a tort route, which most of the West countries would say, I would say this is a great opportunity for India to come up with better practices, so that we don't want our service providers running away, which often happens in the MTP or abortion cases, where doctors are so scared to help, even though they want to help, because of how stringent laws are. So I'm not asking for more stringent laws. What I'm asking is for more positive laws, which are drafted keeping the stakeholders in mind. So everybody comes in saying that Dr. Gauri's experience of seeing teleconsultations, looking at data ethics, looking at patient perspective, and then drafting a law, and then seeking something more positive, instead of coming with a punitive thing, because it's not going to help. You come up with a punitive law, a law which punishes service providers, there will be nobody. Nobody's going to provide services, and we need service providers. So I think so. Before even we demand for something, we have to be very careful, because often these demands have backfired. So I think that this is something we have to be very careful with regard to what do we need, want out of privacy or out of breach of consent.
Thanks. I think there's one last question. I think Manu has this question on what are the challenges in scaling telemedicine like this to like millions of people, right? Like, uh, are there challenges in terms of technology or in terms of even finding doctors?
Yeah, I think I you know I hope I can take this question. I think there are, I mean, of course, there are a lot of challenges, right? So I always look at them from three perspectives, right? So it's the patient, right? So when I look at a challenge, I look at what are those challenges, like what is that the patient would want when it comes to wanting to come on a platform or seeking digital health, right? So patient wants, I think most patients want it to be easy, right? Most patients want it to be more interactive. Most patients want a lot of basket of services as simple, right? They want a lot of things. They would want availability of experienced doctors and doctors with great credentials, or they would want different specialties or super specialties, or people, doctors who would be there in their locality, where, if they can communicate with them online and then go offline as well. So these are the things that a patient would say want, or they would want something which is very easy in terms of the use of technology, right? When it comes to a doctor, I think a doctor would require, or doctor asks for something which would which would help them to make it easy for them, right? Be it, say, presence of tools which helps the doctor which assists the doctors to get more information from the patient, be it in the form of the history that the patient could be giving, or it be in form of any vitals or information about the patient's health at that point in time. Tools to how to use, say, a digital prescription format, wherein what can be done to make it easy for the doctor to do it faster. So these are the things that a patient and a doctor need. So challenges are into how do I feed into these needs, right? So challenges are to create a platform wherein it becomes very easy for the patient to come and see and seek help according to what their needs are. And then making a platform wherein the doctor can then provide it at a such that the doctor is more productive, or use of the doctor's time is done efficiently, right? So those are the challenges that we would want to solve, right? So I think in terms of things that we have been able, I mean, I have seen and have worked for, is the fact that at the end of the day, the patient looks for is a solution, right? So patient wants to get better. I mean, I mean, if I had a health problem and I come to a doctor, I want to get better. Or even if my condition is not something that I can get better with, maybe I want to find a solution or an answer to the question that I may have, right? So as long as we consistently are able to help patients in getting those answers, or maybe not always solution. I think healthcare need not always give solutions, but answers to the questions that patient may have. If we are able to diligently do that every time, I think patients would always want to use such a service, right? In terms of doctors, I think challenges are still there, I feel, because as I mentioned before as well, there's a lot of because there is lack of clarity. Doctors do not know how we can go about doing it, though the current framework gives us some kind of understanding, but when you go at a very day-to-day level, what can be prescribed, what cannot be prescribed, more than that, things in terms of specific, doctors have still not got it. So the challenge of asking the doctor to come online and experience it, and with their experiences trying to create some guidelines of that kind, I think would help in the future for doctors. But what we have seen in, because of the pandemic, doctors have also preferred consulting online. So I have seen a lot of doctors who would want to come online and consult specifically for their own known patients who, like things like people who come for monitoring or their regular follow-ups, and it's better done online because that reduces the risk that the patient might carry. So in terms of challenges, I feel that as more and more people adopt telemedicine, I think the challenges will fizzle down, right? But I think the biggest challenge is having set formats, set rules, set regulations, so that everybody knows for what they can come online and what can be provided online in terms of telemedicine. I think if these are there over a period of time, we can definitely scale up. We can have better services provided, and I'm sure that this would be used by more people in the right way.
Jasmine, I think that's the end of questions. If you have any closing comments, we
Can I
can
just add?
do it. And yeah, please.
Yeah. So just to continue what Dr. Gauri there was saying, I think one challenge that has been on my mind for about 10 years, because I've been doing EHRs for about 8 to 10 years, is that who does an EHR really benefit? What is the use of an EHR? How does it really, like, if you have an honest to God conversation about who is an electronic health record so far actually benefited, and how do we, you know, going forward, make sure that digital health records are actually useful to doctors and to patients, and I mean to patients primarily, and to doctors. I think we need to think differently about how we design them and how we think about health data, and how to use it. So that's a huge challenge. I think we need to stop thinking about uh, digital health as sort of a digital reproduction of the physical, which is a mindset change, which kind of needs to be reflected in guidelines, in the way you're talking about health, you're talking about what you really provide. Yeah.
I just think that we're just collecting the EHRs for now, and later we'll think what to do with it. And I mean, that's generally the problem that all the health facts that are being created. We're just collecting just in case. So, but thank you so much, Dr. Gauri and Dr. Anand, for joining us and also having these honest conversations. Because even though it's the buzzword, but I think so, especially with people who are engaging with it, I mean, we are also being very honest about the limitations and the excellent opportunities. But definitely, if we are going to push for it as the future, or as rightly pointed out, as something that everybody is going to access it, then we better be prepared for all the backlashes or all the loopholes that we might fall into very soon. I just wanted to thank Haskell for actually providing us with a platform to have these conversations, and Karna to actually doing these series of conversations to keep making technology a little more accountable. Because whether we like it or not, and I'm based out of Bangalore, everybody seems to think that technology is the answer for every problem in my life. But I think so, we need to have these conversations that maybe not tech, but some version of tech. And like rightly pointed out by Dr. Anand, not everything offline needs to be replicated online. If we are going to do something, why not learn from the mistakes of the offline world and do it more in a better way? But thank you everybody for joining, and thank you for all the audience for who were giving us with the questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jasmine, for sharing so well, and thank you, guys. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
We will keep these conversations rolling in a later day. I hope we can look into more about this national health stack and EHRs and so on, and we'll keep you
Yes,
engaged.
please.
Thank you for being on, Karana, and explaining us what telemedicine is, and we will end it here.